a privilege to talk today and to share with all of you and to get input from all of you from different parts of the world. So I really appreciate this opportunity and this chance to get to know some of you a bit better. So I'm going to just tell you a little bit about myself. I'm in South Africa. I am in the Eastern Cape, which is on the east side of the southern part of the country. You might know where Cape Town is. Well, I'm on the other side, on the east. I live in a town called Makanda, which is the home of Rhodes University. So we have some other colleagues here in the round table who are at Rhodes, so I'm not at Rhodes. I did a PhD through Wits, which I finished last year. I'm a veteran music teacher. I always tell everybody, for those of you who are South Africans, I'm a musicality and a music auntie. And I've taught music my whole career. I've done mums and babies groups, I've done early learning, I've done tertiary teaching, but my most recent job was as director of music at an independent school where I had a large department and I oversaw everything in the music department from the, the academic stuff and the practical stuff, managing teachers. But the other significant thing about me that I bring to my research is that when I was an undergraduate 40 years ago, I was involved in learning African music through an institute in our town called the International Library of African Music. And as I was learning to play different styles from around Africa, I found it really hard. And I was, I'm quite a musical person, so I'd always found that learning new stuff came very easily. And suddenly I was completely out of my depth and very challenged. And I found that as I started to learn the styles and my competence grew, I really started to, my perception of the music changed radically. So I always had this insight, I think quite early, that there are different values going on and there are different things that are important. There's huge substance in the tradition, but it's different to Western music. And if we try and impose a Western view, slap bang onto African music, we end up being in trouble. So that's my sort of history with African music. And through my life, I've researched and written on African music and particularly how we think about it in curriculum. So in 2014, which feels like a long time ago now, I left my job as director of music at a school and got some funding to do a PhD. So then I sort of got into the meaty part of thinking about curriculum theoretically and how we can do a good job of having African music in curriculum. Okay, so my plan today is just, I've told you I'm going to tell you a bit about the problem that I had and my study, how the LCT concepts really helped me think about my data and undo some of the problems that I found in curriculum, and also how LCT can help me address some of the problems and maybe take us forward into changing curricula in the future. So it all started with a deeply incoherent curriculum. And South Africa, the sort of apartheid era came to a final end in 1994. And we had, right up till 2011, we had several versions of a new curriculum. So obviously there was a need to bring in a completely new curriculum that got away with the past. A lot of South Africa's sort of deep political problems were sort of enmeshed with a curriculum that was deeply conservative. And the versions of the new curriculum were not, without problems. The pendulum swung from one end to the other end, and we eventually ended up in 2011 after, I think, 3 major revisions of a curriculum with the CAPS, which is the Curriculum and Policy Statement. And that was for all subjects, all grades of basic education, grades R through 12. And my concern was with the CAPS for music, which was a grades 10 to 12, which was a matriculation course. And it's for specialist music. So, okay, so it's not a generalist course. It was for kids who want to specialize in music. And there were 3 streams, or there are 3 streams offered in this course. There's Western art music, which is the old-fashioned music that has been in formal curricula forever and ever, which focuses on classical music. There's jazz, and there was what is called indigenous African music. That's the term of the CAPS. It's not necessarily a widely used term. Yeah, nothing more really to say about that. Okay, let's keep going. And in the CAPS for music, there are 3 topics. The curriculum is organized around 3 main topic areas, which wouldn't be surprising. In any curriculum you looked at, there was music performance, so playing your instrument and building up musical skill in performance. The second topic is called music literacy, and that's all about, well, it's basically theory of music, but it's also about learning to read and write music. So it's the script of music, learning about notation, and learning to write music using notation and interpret it. And that would lead to things like reading scores or analysis of works. And the last topic is general music knowledge. So that's, you know, stuff about musical genres, different types of music history. So there were these 3 different topics. Okay, so the big problem, and as having seen these different versions of the curriculum since 1997, and each one was a little bit more, you know, brought more dismay than the last one. They were really all over the place, the curricula, when they first came out. So the new one came out and there was much anticipation to think, okay, is this one going to be any better? And as a music teacher looking at the curriculum for the first time, I was just completely dismayed, because topic 2, or music literacy, is basically one course. So we've got these 3 streams. You've got classical music, African music, and jazz. But the music literacy course, or the music theory, was basically the same content for all 3 streams. The logic was that, you know, you write music down, it doesn't matter what kind of music it is. But I knew that the way Western music is conceptualized in music theory, which is the way it's normally taught, you know, according to the kind of Western structures, conceptually, it just didn't match up with African musical practice. So the abstract structures, or the conceptual structures, were all drawn from classical music, and they just didn't have a hope of matching the practical, suggested the music that was supposed to be, you know, part of the practical part of the course. So there was this juncture, or this lack of alignment between the conceptual frameworks which were offered in the curriculum and the actual music, with the sort of empirical part of the course, which was, you know, the African music, which was the object of study. And in that music literacy, there was no attention paid to the conceptual frameworks of African music. There was no reference to the kind of structures that you would find in African music. There were tiny bits of information, like 5% of the content could have seemed to reference African music, but they were very vague terms. There was never any sense of really conceptualizing how structures work in African traditions. So, you know, my gut feeling as a teacher was, this is just not going to work. And then, you know, once I had started research for my PhD, and somewhere down the line, after a lovely getting to know Bernstein, those of you who know me well, of course, Bernstein led me to LCT. And this gave me the theory to help me understand exactly why there was a problem in the curriculum. And it's all about semantic waves. It's about being able to connect the context-dependent stuff, the musical experience you have, what you understand in the here and now, the stuff that's more context-dependent with more abstract and conceptual ideas. And that knowledge building takes place when there's a kind of fluent flow between these. So if we think about a high semantic flat line, that was where the theory was. It was way up, way out of touch with anything that was empirical or experienced. And you know, in music education in general, there's a problem between the separation of theory and practice, and kids find theory hard because teachers often, you'll learn theory in a room with a piece of paper far away from an instrument. You know, there's a kind of separation of the 2 areas. And in fact, in order to make sense of theory, you need to be able to see what it means in sound and practically apply it. So the low semantic flatline here would be, you know, that was where all the musical experience was sitting, and there was just no connection or hope of connection between the 2. So these concepts really helped me to explain why there was a problem. I knew there was a problem because as a teacher, I just knew it wouldn't work. But this really gave me a theoretical base to say why there was a problem in the curriculum and what we needed to address. So this doesn't want to work now. What's going on? There we go. All right. So because the
can I just ask, Mandy?
Yeah.
Is that because it's for sure known that the more theoretical ideas, even though they're based on a particular corpus, a particular canon, that those ideas we know, or is it just a very strong conjecture that they would not embrace or work or match up to the African musical?
Carl, the very basic concept to find, like how time works and splitting up, beats and intervals and pitch at a very basic level, it works. But as you very quickly in music theory start going, where the music theory courses take you is into what's called tonal functional harmony, which is what the sort of the end goal of Western theory is symphonies and complex harmonic progressions. And so quite quickly you get into that kind of vocabulary or those kind of styles. So the basic stuff, yes, of course you can apply to any, you can take any music in the world and you can say, oh, I can write this down with half notes and quarter notes, and that's fine. But as soon as you get further up in the levels and the theory starts becoming more complex, that complexity matches the values of Western music particularly. So does that answer your question, Carl?
Yeah, that's interesting. It's its objective study is just wrapped into its theoretical framework in that way.
So the baby steps are fine. Those can apply quite widely, but as it starts getting further and further along the way, especially it would come out in the caps in the assessments, when kids would have to maybe write a melody as a one of the tasks for theory is you have to write a melody, and they give you a little a few notes to start with to get an idea of what this melody, how it should continue. Now, they were just so Western based, it was kind of laughable. There was no sense of, it would work, and it's quite archaic in the sense that those kind of exercises are quite particular to pedagogy. They might not even exist in real life, but they certainly wouldn't match the kind of vocabulary of other theory, other musical styles. So it starts becoming obvious further down the track as the conceptual language gets more complex. Okay, so has anyone else got a comment? Okay, so I figured that because I was looking at a really inadequate curriculum for high school or secondary school, that I might look at a tertiary case study to see if they had done a better job, basically, because tertiary courses in African music in South Africa have been going since the 1980s, early in the 1980s. And there are a lot of people who've worked really hard to introduce African music into tertiary courses. Of course, they came into, African music came into universities because there was much more autonomy there than in the schools. So they've been around for a while. There are a number of universities in South Africa that have had African music courses since the 1980s. And they're well thought of. The courses are well thought of. They're run by good people. They're conscientious, and they want to do a good job. And I just thought, okay, well, I'll go to university and I'll see what's going on there and see if they're doing a better job. And I was thinking very much of integration, this problem integration, and thinking if you don't have an integration between your conceptual language and your practical stuff, how can knowledge building take place? And how can knowers be built through the knowledge that they need? So that was my question. What happens in a tertiary African course? What counts? Is there integration between the conceptual and the practical knowledge? And what's the potential for context independence? So, I was also thinking about the Bernsteinian idea of specialized music and going beyond here. And I still am very committed to those ideas about education is supposed to take you somewhere. It's not supposed to just keep you in the same place. It must equip you to apply what you know to a new problem. So that was where I was really coming from. So I was, this sort of, you'll see, and you'll already be feeling as I'm speaking, that I'm talking about the knowledgey parts of the curriculum, not really talking about the knowers yet, but they will come up later on. Okay, what are the problems with African music? Although these courses draw a lot on ethnomusicology and research, it's not as if they don't have backgrounds in sort of scholarly work. But one of the problems with, can anybody tell me how to get rid of this top line? I just don't quite know. Okay, so yeah, this black thing at the top here. Sometimes you click, it just goes away, but it doesn't go away. Okay, all right. So what it says, African music knowledge is new to formal curriculum. So this is a relatively new area in a curriculum. Okay, so African music, obviously, it's been taught and learned for centuries, but it's an oral practice, and there's no history of formal pedagogization in a formal classroom. Okay, there's obviously different traditions and different ways it's taught, and there's been research into how people learn and how the traditions are passed on. Of course, that's there, but the idea of a curriculum, of a coherent curriculum that starts at A and ends at Z, or takes students progressively through material, that is fairly new. What makes this difficult, if you're thinking about the way we normally think about Western education, is that there are no widely shared, there's not a canon, there's not really one body of work that we can pull on. There's no history of printed texts. Of course, there are texts available now, we can find the research, but you think about Western music, you've got 500 years of printed music, of a tradition, so there's plenty of stuff to deal with. In African music, you don't have that. You've got lots of micro traditions, so you don't really have one body of knowledge, body of knowers with a shared disciplinary knowledge. You've got lots of people who know lots of different things, and they might not really have much to do with each other. It's not one sort of monolithic culture that can be drawn on for school. So you've got a problem with, let's bring this oral practice into school, but what do we draw on that is more complicated? And I think that, I'm sure there are many of you here today who have also been thinking about that sort of recontextualization of oral knowledge, especially with the need to acknowledge indigenous knowledges. So that's the problem, really. So it's not as if there's not writing about this. There is a body of literature which talks about the musical arts in Africa. So I just think about it as African music education, but the term that is used by these writers is the musical arts in Africa. And it's the idea that it's not just music we're talking about. African music hearing always involves dance and poetry and drama and costume. So it's a kind of conglomerate of arts together. And that's where the logic of the term comes. But this literature is mainly philosophical. And it identifies values, highlights the values of humanity. The idea that there's some form of original African knowledge that's available. So that's original African knowledge, like before Africa got tainted by colonizers. It's rather essentialist, but that is the sort of the value that's promoted in the literature. And that's what's tied to that also is music education as moral education. So music has always been a way of it's been a form of education in African society. Children learned the mores of their culture through music. It probably happens in many cultures, but in Africa, that was a very central part of the tradition. So music education is seen as a way of perpetuating the values of any particular culture. In this literature, apart from that sort of philosophical thread or the threads, there is an unquestioned use of Western music theory. So these writers never problematize Western music theory. They just see it as a way to write the music down. It's a tool, which it is. So they would promote, okay, you're going to do this in your classrooms, but then just the music theory is fine, just use it. It's not really problematized. Another thing that happens in this literature is that it tends to highlight traditional forms. So if you think about where we are today, 2021, there's lots and lots and lots of music in Africa, but there are lots of hybrid forms. These deeply traditional practices do still happen in pockets, but for instance, in my part of the world, where the language group is isiXhosa, and I've got a picture a bit later of a woman playing a traditional instrument. If I carried an uhadi around in my area, then probably very, very few people would know what it was, never mind having heard it being played. So these traditional forms are marginalized, but the literature seems to talk about it as if it's still very much part of everyone's practice and everyone's knowledge, and that the knowledge is just all there and it's available for everybody. So that's problematic, because actually it just isn't. All right, so just telling you a little bit about this tertiary course, going back to the tertiary course. It's a 3-year diploma course with an optional 4th year for a degree. And it's a specialist course in African music with an entrance by audition. So the students who come in don't have to have any formal training at all in music. They audition by performing, and if they're seen as having the potential, or they've got talent, they've got promise, then they make it into the course. Many of the students are from disadvantaged backgrounds. If any of you know about South Africa, we've got a really sad history of very, very poor education offered, especially to the Black community. There was a kind of tiered order in who got the best resources, and of course white people were at the top and Black people were at the bottom. So we've got this legacy of disadvantage. So the students are ill prepared for tertiary study. And these are the students who come into this course because they actually don't need to have a full university entrance in order to get in, hence the diploma course with an option for a 4th year to actually get a degree, which would normally have been done in 3 years. Okay. And the course design matches that of classical music, similar things. You've got performance, you've got theory. And I've got 3 lecturers. You can't see here their names, but I've given the pseudonyms Daniel, Joseph, and Sia. Okay, and my research took place right in the middle of the student protests in 2015 and 2016. And so it has to be seen in that context. The Rhodes Must Fall protest was all about decolonizing the curriculum and a rejection of a curriculum that was colonial in spirit and form. And this is a photograph of the statue of Rhodes himself, the colonizer Rhodes, at the University of Cape Town. The protests around it, and eventually the statue was removed. Okay, so let's look at the courses. The guy who's a course coordinator, Daniel, is absolutely committed to an idea of integration. So the problem that I saw in the CAPS is the problem that he also sees as a problem in music education. So he's really, really committed to making those connections between abstract stuff and practical stuff. And all of his lessons, in all the lessons in the course, they're facilitated by Daniel and usually either Sia or Joseph. We're always a bit uncomfortable in South Africa talking about race, but Daniel is a white guy and he has got, a training in Western music, and then he came to African music later in his life. But he's the guy with the sort of most highly qualified in the kind of conventional sense of a university. And Sia has got a master's, but he's a traditional performer, and Joseph has no university training at all. Joseph is a West African dance and drum instructor. Okay. When Daniel teaches, he uses PowerPoints, and he's always got a PowerPoint with lots and lots of knowledgey concepts on the screen. And this is just a tiny example of the sort of thing that would be in his PowerPoints. So they have got weaker semantic gravity, and they've got stronger semantic density. They are quite dense. They are taxonomies, it's hierarchical knowledge. All of these terms could be unpacked further. So I've got pattern organization, And then 3 things there, but all those 3 things, duration, tone, color, and pitch, all of those could be further broken up into different concepts and ideas. So as he's talking about this stuff, he uses downward escalators. Okay, so he avoids technical terminology. He'd rather use everyday terms. He speaks as much as possible in everyday language. And I think that's a concession to the fact that he's working with students whose mother tongue is not English. But he really avoids technical terminology. He always unpacks meaning, but he never repacks it. And as he's talking about the concept, Sia or Joseph lead the students in enacting it practically. So what happens is Joseph does the talking and he starts sort of decoding everything into simple language. The students play, they don't talk, they don't write, and they don't decode notation. They just play, they follow Sia or Joseph. And that's the lesson, actually. And that happens in all of the lessons, which although you've got theory of music and practical timetables separately in the courses, and of course they're examined separately for the purposes of the university because there are different courses. In fact, all the lessons look the same. They all take the same form. And this is because of Daniel's concern with integration. Okay, but what happens in practice is that although they've got these concepts and they've got the practice, it's all going in one direction. So the students tend not to get a good control over the sort of abstract conceptual stuff. So if I'm thinking about knowledge and knowledge building, that was a problem, okay? And of course, the other option is that you learn by acquiring a gaze, by induction into a practice. So what were the issues as those students were amongst the lecturers? What were they learning from the lecturers? So in Daniel's lessons, apart from all that sort of knowledge-y stuff here, as he was explaining all these things, his language was absolutely peppered with axiological stuff. He would say things like this: understanding with your mind is only the beginning. It's when you get into the practice that it becomes real. It was a kind of concession to the fact that music is actually all about feeling. It's not necessarily about all these heavy terms that are hard to understand. He also talked about creativity a lot and looking for students' uniqueness. He was always trying to encourage students to find their unique contribution. He also talked about feel, and this is a big thing in music. It doesn't have to be a complicated thing, but it's got to have that feel. So having the feel is a crucial part of being a sort of legitimate knower. It's quite hard to explain what that means. And it's a bit of one of those issues that if you have to ask, well, then maybe you're in the wrong course. Feel is something that's hard to pin down, but absolutely crucial to have. But he would talk about feel and not really explain. None of these statements would ever be contextualized or critiqued. They were just sort of part of what Daniel talked about. Sia, who is a Xhosa guy from originally from the Eastern Cape, where I come from, he was really into cultural beliefs. He taught a lot of practical stuff, but he, as I said, he has a master's, so he has got a grasp of conceptual theoretical content. But he would always sort of, his default position was to go to cultural beliefs. So he would tell stories about what happened in the music, what happened when they were performing, and it was often going into the metaphysical. For instance, this is the Ohadibo, which is, the lady's actually got a little, in her right hand, she's holding a very fine little stick, which she's beating a bow. You can't see the string, but it's vertical. It's like a sort of hunting bow, but it's got a calabash attached to it. And he would explain how this music induces labor in pregnant women. So there were those sorts of stories and the information about the sort of contextual cultural information, but it was never really went anywhere, and it was never a part of the assessment, this stuff. Okay. Joseph is from West Africa, and he was a brilliant drummer and dancer. He'd been part of a West African performing troupe, since the time he was a child. And he was a brilliant facilitator. His pedagogy was mostly nonverbal. He spoke English well, but he didn't really talk when he taught. He would use eye contact a lot and gesture in the air. And when he did talk, it was usually, you know, sort of telling people to sit up straight or play harder or to stop talking. It was sort of regulative discourse that came in his language. So what he wanted was accurate playing. He wanted the students to follow instructions and pay attention. And it was a friendly tone in the class. Yeah.
Hello, Mandy.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Mona. I'm a lecturer here in Thailand, but I'm a Filipino. I am just curious because you talked about how indigenous South African music is taught in the class, and you emphasize the use of everyday language. So I wonder if there are if are there terminologies in South African languages, just apart from English, that capture the technicalities of African music? Because I'm thinking of it in the situation of the indigenous music in the Philippines. So the nuances of the indigenous music of the Philippines is actually encoded or embedded in their indigenous languages. So I wonder if there are like terminologies that are embedded in South African languages aside from English that can be perhaps used in teaching.
Yeah, thanks for your question. That's really interesting issue. Well, first of all, there's little language because generally people in general people don't talk about music, they play it. So there are few terms. You might find in one tradition there's a term that means something, and you could use it, and it could certainly be explored for sort of what it means, its deeper concepts, but it wouldn't apply generally to like even if I'm talking about my country in South Africa, where there are 11 different language groups. What one thing might mean in one language probably wouldn't be applicable in another language. So and so what's happened in the certainly in the CAPs is there are terms that seem to be made up, which are problematic in themselves. And just going back to Daniel, his use of everyday language, there was nothing wrong with it in terms of pedagogy. It's a good idea, but he never ever got the students to get control over those sort of more complex concepts themselves. And of course, all of those concepts I showed you are from ethnomusicological research, so they are pertaining to African ideas generally. Those aren't really Western, no, those aren't drawn from Western theory. So the whole area of language and taxonomies is actually is an interesting one. But and actually I did come up in my research if you're interested, but not necessarily going into it in detail here.
Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else have a comment? Okay, so going back to Joseph, my dance drummer. Apart from the sort of regulative discourse of wanting people to listen and pay attention, the other thing that was valued in his classes was his disciplined body and his physicality, which was kind of larger than life and energized and full of strength and focus. So he modeled something to the students, and they were all in awe of him, rightly so. He was a superb musician, but he kind of embodied this a stereotypical idea of the African music maker, and that was what counted. It wasn't he wanted them to understand structure, but he never explained it, and when they couldn't get it right, he didn't really have the tools to explain it to them, even though they had been doing that kind of structural conceptual stuff with Daniel. So it was an interesting thing where the focus was in his lessons. So amongst these three lecturers, if we were thinking about gaze, of what are the values that are coming across to the students and what are they supposed to be learning from these three different lecturers, they were problematic, these meetings, because they varied between the different lecturers, and in fact they seemed to contradict one another. So Joseph would be really keen on everybody doing the right thing and conforming to the group, but Daniel would be telling them that they needed to develop their own uniqueness. So there was contradiction in what they said. they were never really explained or contextualized. So information was sent out, but it wasn't really, it was kind of dropped and never really given any explanation. They're also, these sorts of meanings are less explicitly articulated than the epistemic meaning. So if we think back to that slide of those theoretical concepts, those were kind of carefully shown in their taxonomies. They were explicit, you could get an explicit meaning out of them, even if the pedagogy was a bit sort of garbled. These sorts of messages were sort of sent out and dropped, but not really ever explained or thought, you know, or contextualized for students to understand what they meant and how they could understand them. And the other thing that was a problem, I think, was that hello? Oh, it was, oh, someone's got a mic on. These meanings were sort of indistinguishable in terms of importance. So from the student's point of view, it was difficult to tell if what Daniel was saying about being a unique musician, or Sia was talking about metaphysical issues or metaphysical stories in culture, which were the most important. And they tended, you know, they didn't come up in the formal assessment. So it was also hard to see if they counted at all in the assessment. So one way to try and understand what the students were picking up, I didn't interview students. I was, you know, I set out to try and understand curriculum and what was going out to the students, and limited the idea of what the students were picking up. But one way to try and see how they interpreted all this stuff was in the students' performance recital. And I only saw two 45-minute student recitals, which part of a third year assessment. So they had to do a solo program at the end of their third year. It was a solo program, but they had musicians playing with them. They were sort of them with their bands. And what the students focused on was all personal meaning. So they, in their written program notes and in their introduction to the songs, they spoke about the people that were important to them, how they learned the song, who they'd played the song with, who they knew through the music, and then also the personal feelings that the songs evoked. So they talked about feelings of, and especially now, remember, we're in the sort of roads must fall, fees must fall era of student protests. There was a lot of talk about loneliness and about feeling dispossessed. So those sort of personal feelings were to the fore in the exam. So all the other content of the course, like all that conceptual stuff, learning about musical structure, learning about musical history, learning about geographical regions of how music was different in this area to that area, none of that came through in their explanations of their songs. It was all just on a personal level. So what I can say is that the messages in the African music course were competing. There was a sort of, all the lessons contained epistemic or knowledge stuff, but they also contained axiological meaning, stuff about value, but these things seem to compete with each other. Daniel, for example, was always talking about intersonic meanings, which I haven't explained. It's about music structure, the relationships between the sounds themselves, but he always downplayed these meanings, such that I think that the students actually never saw the value of them. Sia's cultural information was excluded from the assessment. All of these things are sort of compete with each other, and they suggest a kind of hybrid or confused gaze. And the one thing that was quite interesting, it wasn't in any of the course material, but Daniel, as the course coordinator, said to me several times that his goal was for students to play, sing, and write articulately about music. But in fact, none of these three lecturers could do all three of those things. So Daniel, as a sort of Western trained guy, couldn't really play in a convincing way. He could write and he could speak about African music, but he couldn't play. Joseph was a brilliant player, but he didn't really do any talking. And Sia also didn't fulfill all of those three criteria. So none of these guys were modeling that goal, if that was the goal of the course. And it's interesting to ask, well, what were the students supposed to learn? So if they weren't being able to build knowledge because there were these interrupted semantic waves in the courses, then you think, okay, well, fine, they're going to be mentored and they're going to learn from the mentors, but the mentors were offering them quite a confused gaze. So if I say, all right, well, what counts in this tertiary music course?
Can I just ask, so is there two problems then? Is that the knowledge side of things seems somewhat fragmented or not fragmented, but inexplicit quite often.
Yeah.
And that's potentially fine if you've got a kind of cohering gaze on the social relations side of things.
Precisely.
But you're saying that that's also not quite there, at least across these things. Would the same students do all the different courses?
Yes.
So
Precisely.
they're getting three.
You've hit it
very
exactly,
different,
Carl. Yes.
They're getting three very different ideas of what a kind of musical knower is as well.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which must be quite difficult for the student.
I think so. Yeah. And I think that there was this idea, and it was done with the best of intentions, but I think from Daniel's point of view, he sort of felt like the students would just, they'd be presented with all the stuff and they would just absorb it and end up with all the right things. But in fact, I think there was such confusion as to, and of course, identity is a complex thing, and what students actually perceive is a complex thing. So you can't really presume what
no, neither can you presume that a classroom environment is a long enough time frame for
precisely
slow road transfer of knower kind of ideas. And and the notion that just being around that knowledge is the idea that gaze is a sort of Delta variant, he says coughing, COVID virus that can be just picked up by very quick transmission between people is not really the case. Just the idea of being in the same room without a mask or whatever, and suddenly you're going to pick it up it takes quite a lot of exposure to a gaze, and also if that has to be relatively coherent as a gaze.
Precisely. So there is this idea, I think, that in music education that you can in a school replicate what happens out in practice. For instance, like how popular musicians learn. Popular musicians learn by sitting on their bed with their guitar for hours and hours and hours and hours. They might not have a teacher. Nowadays they might have a YouTube video, but the time that they spend there cannot be replicated in a school where they have 40 minutes of music and then they're going off to maths or to
just to add to that, and we can't always believe the popular vision either, because Saul Richardson's PhD is quite interesting in one chapter in which he shows that all these professional jazz musicians claim that they just picked up jazz by breathing in the right environment and just hanging around the right people. And then he revealed that all these famous jazz musicians had serious, intense and prolonged professional training, but they then hide it all and say, hey, I just went to the bandstand and I just kind of picked it up. I just started, I picked up a pair of, and I just started playing drums and it just came to me because I just oozed jazz, And then it turns out that they spent they've been trained since the age of 5.
Yes. Well, you see, it's an important thing, because you're trying to underline the fact that you've got this natural talent, that it just bubbles out of you. So that's what happens. And I can tell you, Carl, that Saul and Christine Carroll and Jack and I presented at a conference this year, and man, did people respond. And then the most lively debate came from Saul's talking about that idea about, in jazz, there's this narrative that you just got to have it, but in fact, it's all about learning. And it was like, a bomb went off. It was really interesting.
Yeah, and the wonderful thing about LCT is you can then analyze that.
Yeah, that was amongst music, at a music conference.
That's a code clash, yeah. So I'll have to, maybe I didn't get to chat to Saul about that, but one of the lessons, I mean, this is a slight digression, but one of the lessons for this sort of thing is to, for that sort of thing is to try to work out how to, you know, provide a connection between the codes you're bringing and the codes of the audience. So
Yes.
For example, a very crude example from very early in my PhD actually was when I gave a talk to a cultural studies conference about saying that standpoint theory was basically the same as the divine right of kings and papal infallibility, and was the most conservative intellectual position you could imagine. But I just covered it in lots and lots and lots of we, us, our, and the complete lack of conceptual technicality. So I just went as Noah code on the delivery as I possibly could, and it didn't, you know, it didn't cause I didn't get crucified or anything. No.
Yeah. Anyway, thanks for those comments, Carl. So if I was looking at what kind of integration there was in this tertiary music course, as Carlos said, there was already a problem in the interruption of the knowledge building. Okay. And there was also an interruption in the gaze. It was very confusing how these students were supposed to learn. So then I thought, well, what's the potential here for context independence? Is there any? And this is exactly what the lack of coherence was in the CAPS. There was a problem with knowledge. There was a problem with semantic waving in the knowledge. What counts was quite confusing. And how you learn it wasn't clear. There was, you know, the sort of axiological stuff kept crashing in some way or other, but didn't really help. So now I'm going into an area where I feel like I really want input from you guys, because I've known, you know, as I've listened to other presentations and read that constellations is a really exciting and has great potential for what I'm doing and what I'm trying to look at. But I've got some preliminary ideas here, and I'd really appreciate what you guys have to say about them. So I'm thinking here about an epistemic constellation for music, and I'm not talking about any particular style of music. Okay, so this is not classical music, this is not African music, this is just music. All right, and there's stuff that you should know to do music. So at the bottom I've got skill, which just seems to be the obvious thing that you should know, but it is a skill, it's a technique that you have to build up. It's not something that just happens to you. It's something you need to develop. Top left-hand corner, we've got musical structure. You cannot make sense of music or play it unless you have insight into structure. You don't have to have it doesn't have to be abstract, or it doesn't have to be formal, but you do have to understand how chords work or how melodies work or how timing works, even if that is a tacit understanding. You know, we know about grammatical rules in our mother tongue without having to be able to recite grammatical rules in grammar. So the same thing happens in music, but you do have to have insight into music structure in order to play. You also need to have an understanding of musical expression in your genre. You know, those we can put bubbles out and more nodes coming out of these different central nodes, for example, of expression. You know, how things should sound, how they should feel, what makes something more exciting, what makes something less exciting. All those things are something you should know, and they also feed into your skill as well as what you know in an abstract way about music. And then at the bottom here, some of which are covered up by your lovely faces. You need to know about repertoire. You need to know the history of, or not the history, but you need to know about the body of works that you're interested in. So if you're into hip hop, you need to listen to a lot of hip hop. You need to know who the main artists are. You need to know how this thing developed, where it came from, the changes, the texts, and the stylistic features. So all of these things are things to know about music, whether you're talking about whatever style you're talking about. And it's not just something that, you know, you can do or you can't do, as Saul says about jazz. All of these things go into building the knower. And now we want to go to the next slide. Is it going to work? There we go. So if I were thinking about an axiological constellation, there are different, now we're talking about values here, okay? And I've got three different fields, the green, the sort of orangey brown color and the blue, these are sort of areas of music education in African music, which I've just been talking about. They're big values that are talked about in the philosophy, like humanity and morality and original knowledge. In classical music, we've got things like discipline and respect and control, which are held up as values. In progressive approaches in music education, which is a kind of reaction to the extremes of classical music and the problems of classical music, there's a far more, there's a big emphasis on social justice and democracy and diversity and creativity. And in the pink circles, what I have is not so much these big questions in fields, but the individual feelings and delineations, as Lucy Green calls them, the meanings that we have when we listen to music, the memories and the associations it evokes for us, the judgments we put on it, whether it's classy or sophisticated or rubbish or violent or energizing. So the pink buttons are really very much the individual responses, but they do all of these things together. You know, those delineations feed into these other areas. They play a role. What was interesting about this, going back into my research, the students and their exams and the exam presentations, all they talked about were the delineations, the bottom right-hand corner here, which is very kind of centered in their own experience, in their own subjectivity. It's a vital part of music, but it can't be everything that you know in a curriculum. And I'm suggesting that if we're going to build knowledge in music, and I'm now back in the epistemic constellation, so the knowledgey stuff, there needs to be a kind of wave in and between all of these things. You build knowledge, you build musical skill by understanding musical structure and going back into the skill. You increase your skill by understanding more about expression and understanding more about repertoire. So there's a sort of wave that goes in and between all of these things. The other thing I want to suggest, and I'm not sure how it would work in maybe some of you have fields where this would make sense, is the bringing together of the epistemic and the axiological. So when axiological, and I'll go back to that, can become very subjective and maybe biased, and I'm looking at those pink circles now, the way to increase the criticality or to give students more of a view, a less biased view of music, is for them to turn back to the epistemic. And this is an idea from Lucy Green's work. She talks about critical musicality, where she says that there has to be the connections made between understanding the structures and understanding how we feel about the music, or the sort of social meanings of the music, and making the two more explicit. And this sounds like a very abstract thing that I'm talking about now, but it means that if you think of the music as having some kind of big meaning, like humanity, that African music is all about humanity, you start looking in the music for where we can see musical structure or musical patterns or musical practices that promote that humanity. And I can give you an example right away. You might know what call and response is, but it's when somebody sings a song, and then there's an answer. There's a sort of secondary phrase that comes in after the song, and that's a very strong and common structural form right throughout Africa, that call and response. But it essentially needs two people. So that sense of two people being in community reflects the sense of humanity. And so bringing these big ideas, or these sometimes subjective ideas about that we make claims about music, and bringing them down to earth by connecting them to the epistemic meanings. So essentially, we need to make a connection between axiological and the epistemic and make it explicit. So if any of you have got any ideas about that, or if anything sparks off in you, or you just think, I don't know what she's talking about, do feel free to say something. Okay, so if we're recontextualizing oral traditions, or what Adora Hoppers calls previously silenced epistemologies, we
Sorry, I
really
will
need.
ask the question,
Yeah,
Mandy.
yeah. Okay.
Are you? You're talking about. Do you want to go back a couple of slides? So you're talking about moving between different kinds of meaning.
Yes.
That may involve movements in complexity and context dependence. So that's when you'd have waves.
Yes.
But if we just leave aside the waving side of things for a minute, you're talking, because there's two things going on here. So you've got shifts in semantics, and you're also talking about shifting between epistemological sort of stuff and the more axiological sort of stuff. As a focus or as a basis?
As a basis.
As a basis. So maybe shifting and doing right. I mean, would they be kind of connected in the sense of, well, how would that so would when doing the stuff in the epistemic constellation or the knowledge constellation or whatever you want to call it, you think then it should be not just looking at these sorts of things, but also taught with where the basis of understanding that, the basis of pedagogy. Sharon, can you, thanks, would be more kind of knowledge code. And then when we shift to looking at, can you go forward one? We shift to looking at the other constellation. Yeah. So when talking about discipline or perfection or shared meaning, memories and creativity, that sort of thing should be discussed in a where the basis is sort of like, through a gaze or something. I'm just trying to get a sense of whether, because you could shift between these things entirely in a knowledge code.
The thing that the problem with axiology in music is it's really iffy, and it's I think iffy in the sense that it is these concepts are there. Or for instance, like classical music has this sort of value of discipline, for example. But what does that mean? And yes, I can start explaining what that means. Or if I look at African music and I think, and there's a claim that it's about morality. Well, what does that mean? And it tends to be, whether it's a big abstract noun like that, or whether it's something that's quite personal and something that I listen to this music, and like those students giving their presentations, they were talking about, the granny who taught them this song, which is important and valid, but it isn't actually, it's just so, the context is that it's just so closed in if that's all they're talking about, I'm not sure if we're talking about something that's worth learning at a university. I think they need to
that's a massive jump from what I was talking about. I was just wondering about I'm completely agnostic about all that sort of stuff, but I was just wondering about how this sort of stuff gets done. So for example, if you look if we think about Eleanor Lamprinos's PhD on ballet, and it may be to do with the way that ballet is taught, but she was able to break down these sorts of things like discipline and so on into from kind of like knower sort of dispositions to specific behaviors and so on. Now that's in a particular kind of field, ballet, where it's very prescriptive and it's very, very strongly explicit. But it's possible. So I was just thinking it's possible to do even knower focus stuff in a knowledge code way. And I was just wondering if is that what you were suggesting, or I mean, how I'm just playing devil's advocate as to whether this sort of stuff, this vague stuff, which can be vague, not necessarily. Not axiology is frustratingly often kind of ephemeral. I think of it being more like when we go from the epistemological, we're in a kind of world which feels a little bit more like a kind of Newtonian world of physics, where you have you can actually draw ideas and relations between them and typologies and hierarchies and sort of all sorts of things that are quite explicit. And then when you get into the axiological realm, it's getting into sort of quantum mechanics of there's like probability fields and no longer do we think of it as like the inside of an atom, like being a little solar system. We now have these fields of probability, which is really a bit of a mindfuck in terms of trying to get a mental picture of what the hell does any of this mean. It can be hard to pin down, but not always necessarily. So like in ballet, you can get that stuff pinned down because it's made so explicit.
Yeah,
so
but the reason
at the moment, this stuff is not. You're saying.
Yeah, but the reason it's so explicit in ballet is you've got a knower, you've got a mentor who's already been through the system and has been inducted into the system. So and she is in and those values in ballet are sort of stable and they've been established. And of course there are lots of different kind of ballet teachers who might teach something that's a little bit different, but it's exactly the same with classical music. You've got somebody who's been inducted into this practice over a long time, and they then are able to inculcate the learner into the same values. The trouble with music is it's so full of value judgments and emotions and feelings, but that's just what music does for us. We want it to do that for us, but they kind of muddy the waters in terms of what it is that you're actually supposed to be learning. So it might also be, it's the same problem as Saul has got. There's stuff to learn, but the narrative, the axiological stuff is so noisy that it often, and especially as these progressive approaches become stronger and stronger, the knowledge just actually becomes less and less visible, and the axiological stuff gets louder and louder, and you end up with students who actually don't know very much. So this idea of connecting the axiological with the epistemic, that's quite a sort of like a broad claim or idea, or quite a jump. But I'm coming back to this idea that Lucy Green talks about, where the more insight you have into musical structure, the more you understand that the axiological stuff is maybe unstable or subjective or can change. So, the idea of morality is just an idea, but it has real consequences in the world. But looking and tying it more closely to the actual epistemic helps us to question the axiological value and to say, actually, is it a good fit? Is it good for us? Do we want to say, yes, it's a great thing for us? Or do we want to say, no, we need to challenge it? Okay, so I'm glad some of you are stuck as me about this. Silence out there. Okay, so
hi, Mandy.
Yeah, hi.
Hi,
Claire.
I'm Claire. I'm from Adelaide. I can relate to a lot of what you're talking about because I, grew up doing music all the way through the schooling system here, and then I did a music studies degree at university. Okay. And just what's kind of coming up for me is that what counts as the discipline of music, as I experienced it through the, say, 90s and 2000s, is Western music. It isn't like Indigenous music does not count as within that framework. So music, when you're studying it, has disciplinary boundaries and, you move through the note code as a younger person, and it's all about feelings, and then you learn the structures, and it's all about the knowledge, and then you put them together. And, when I was doing piano at university, it's very elite code. So, I have to have the intellectual knowledge, but I have to have the feeling and the response as well. Yeah. And just from my experience, then musicology was a different discipline. Yes. And you could use the methods of musicology to study Indigenous music as an object of study, but you couldn't. There's just no conception of learning Indigenous music. It's seen as a completely other like a totally separate thing to the discipline. It's an object of study. So what just seems to be going through my mind is that the problem when you're trying to teach African music as a university subject, when the pedagogy of teaching a discipline has been attached to Western music. I mean, how do you detach the disciplinary boundaries from a discipline which is only Western music and build a new discipline that's African music? Is that?
Yeah, but I think that you see, this is precisely what the issue is, that you need to bring a criticality to it. So you're looking hard at the issues, and you see what's happening, because all over the world there's indigenous music being brought into curricula, but the axiological stuff is so strong.
Is that though because there isn't a knowledge code element? That's not established. There's no.
It hasn't been established. I think depends on the practice, but it's not as if it's without knowledge or without concept. You can't have music without there being some conceptual framework. You know, all music has got some kind of conceptual framework.
I guess I wonder.
If you're comparing, practice A from somewhere in the world, a random society with Western classical music, you might say, well, actually, there's a whole lot more in Western classical music, but it's not as if to say that there's nothing to learn in those other practices.
No, exactly.
But the trouble, I mean, there's huge problems of what's more valuable and what's more difficult. And those sorts of things, I think, are also the sort of the noisiness of the axiology that we need to kind of see through. And we need to start understanding what some of these loud things are that we hear about discipline and respect and sophistication, and recognize them for what they are, and critique them, and to get down to the real stuff.
Mandy?
Hi, Nick.
Request here. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
Good, surviving. On that note, it's actually very interesting. And throughout the whole discussion, I've been thinking also of my own background, which is, well, I'm actually Greek, and the Greek traditional music scene. And it resonates quite nicely, because there's a lot of, you can take someone and teach them how to play Greek musical instruments and how to play the melody. But there is a lot in it about being Greek and understanding how to play it from a quote unquote Greek perspective. And I suppose the same applies to African music. You need to almost understand African culture and how music interacts with African culture, and understand the big picture before you can actually really play the music convincingly. So again, it goes back to a long process of cultivation. And I see the same thing, with Greek dancing, for that matter. You can teach someone the steps, but you almost need to spend 5 years in Greece, really sort of, getting into it before it starts becoming part of you. So I find these discussions extremely interesting. So yes.
Yeah, well, you need to be a part of a community of in a community of practice. And the interesting thing is that because Western music is kind of, it's like whiteness, it's so normalized. We think that you don't need to, be, exposed to all that to be able to learn it. Of course you do. Western music is no different, or classical music is no different, than what you're saying about Greek music. You have to be inducted into the practice. You have to spend lots of time listening, lots of time with other musicians. So it's just because it's sort of seen as the kind of neutral default one, that we think that all those other world musics and ethno musics are different. They're not. Thanks for that, Nick.
Mandy, can I come in here? So just following up on Nick's question, was there a kind of an application or criteria entrance in terms of a musicality, some sort of musical history, or some kind of who might enter those courses? Was it in any way kind of restricted in terms of who you had to be or what you had to know in order to come into those African music courses that you analyzed? In other words, was the knower kind of filtered out up front, and was it on the basis of who they were or what they knew?
It was entirely an audition. So if the student was perceived as musically talented and having potential, you know, as an African performer, then they got in. They did actually have to do a theory test, but it was more a kind of are we putting you into music theory for beginners or music theory for people who know a little bit about music. But, you know, it didn't stop them getting into the course if they failed completely. It was just a kind of, which stream are we putting them into? So no, it was purely on the audition that they got in.
And it's only later that it appears that the kind of knower you are actually makes a huge difference. Thanks. That's interesting.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so I was here before. And we've got this problem of bringing oral knowledges into a curriculum, and I just think it needs huge consideration and care. There's always knowledge, and that knowledge has to be presented in a way that's conducive to semantic waving. I could say that categorically. I feel very confident about that. And I can also say that the right disposition needs clear role models. And as Carl pointed out, you know, in a course, you suddenly got much less time and a different context. So it's not so easy to get the gaze when you're going to your music class and then you're going to your physics class. But, you know, building a right disposition in ballet happens because you've got a teacher who's already being inducted. And as we said earlier, and the same thing with classical music. Or if I'm learning mbira in Zimbabwe from a guy who's a brilliant practitioner, I will go and live with him in the village for as long as I can get away with, and that's how I learn, by induction, by that. And he's a very clear role model because he's the real deal. You know, he knows what he's doing, he comes from the tradition, but you can't really replicate that in a school. So, you know, if you're going to try and think about building those in schools, it needs quite a lot of care. And I think that criticality is just absolutely crucial in all of this. And I think the LCT toolbox gives us tools to be critical, to start saying, what is the knowledge? What kind of knower are we looking for here? What's the axiological content doing? What is the epistemic content? And how do these all talk to each other? So I've talked about a little bit there, where will constellations take me? And I've had some feedback. Thank you very much. But I think that's what I want to say to you today. And thanks for listening, and let's keep talking. Yeah, that's where we are.
Thanks, Mandy.
Yeah.
Does anybody just jump in, anybody and everybody, and say anything you like about, I mean, like these, the thing that I always used to emphasize to Saul with his PhD on jazz is that the PhD wasn't about jazz. So he was focused very much on jazz. And for me, I was always really interested in jazz as an example of the same sort of thing as I see in all sorts of areas in which, you know, you have knowledge being hidden and then knowers not being cultivated.
Yes.
You know, and so you end up excluding people. So I think there's like, this is, or in this case, this must have a lot of relevance for a wide range of areas in which you get attempts to either sort of force in kind of everyday, I don't like these labels, but sort of everyday or contextual kind of experiential forms of knowledge, and sort of making them kind of very knowledge code like, or just having a kind of tokenistic imposition or injection of role models who then don't know how to role model.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, just being who you are is not normally much of a role model. You actually need to, even if your pedagogic model is tacit, you need to actually engage in pedagogy, not just sort of present yourself. So I'm assuming that this must, I imagine this must have relevance for quite a lot of people's sort of ideas or the kind of debates they've heard or engaged with across other areas of the map. So just jump in, anybody and everybody.
I'll jump in super quick. Mandy, thank you. That was fantastic. And it's been a long time since I've been to a round table, so it was a wonderful return.
Thank you, Sharon.
Look, you've really just left me with more to think about. I've been involved with working with some Indigenous educators, developing some units of study for a social work degrees. And on the surface, it would seem to have very little in common, but actually a lot of what you brought up is kind of underlying some of the strengths and challenges we're finding with the educators. They're, very insistent on, I'd say there's very strong NOAA code. It's all about the kind of local knowledge they have. We've had quite a lot of issues with not being able to share PowerPoint presentations, for instance, because people don't want to be seen to be talking to other people's local areas and local practices and local understandings. And in fact, a quite strong resistance is the wrong word. The idea of delivering sort of written content or planned PowerPoints just does not mesh with the way the educators see a strength, their best strength in delivering the information. It's far more based around sort of stories and interaction with the students. And it's a very sort of, it seems to be situated on a lot more of an emotional kind of level of practice, where they're sort of trying to induce certain feelings in the students towards, often quite horrific, historic events. And I think the questions you were raising around the axiology just gave me a really useful way to start thinking about how that would be mapped. And I guess the one thing that I've been reflecting on is that epistemologies, while we can look for underlying principles, certainly all my educators have a very strong epistemology, but we can't get away from the local situation for each of those. Like I'm imagining you can't get away from even the local musical styles that each one is teaching to. And there's something to do with how we situate that local within it seems to be important.
Yeah. Yeah, really interesting. I mean, one of the things I find, in my engagement with international music education and the question of Indigenous knowledge is that it's very different in different parts of the world. So I don't know if there's anyone here from BC in Canada, but the issues that they're dealing with their Indigenous peoples and Africa are really quite different. So and you speaking to Australian issues, they're all slightly different, but I think what there is in common is there's different types of knowledge, and there's the issues of, there's actually the sort of knowledgey stuff that you can pin down, and then there's all this axiological stuff, and the axiological stuff just tends, it can be so out of control, and it's even if you take it with huge respect and you say, yes, we want to get a grip of this, because it's often so cloudy and difficult to pin down, it's very difficult to recontextualize. Or to put into, let's say, okay, we're going to do this in school because we want it to be respected, we want it to be valued, and that's how we're going to value it, is by putting it in curriculum. But then, we have to kind of get to grips with it, I think. And it's possible. I think it's possible to do that. At the same time, you don't want chapter and verse with all of this stuff. There has to be the sense of, wonder, mystery, whatever. I'm a great believer in all of that. But at the same time, it's problematic when you're trying to curricularize it.
Yeah, that's where we face the challenge. We can teach it to one group of students very effectively, but if we try and produce a generalized curriculum across 3 different learning sites, all of a sudden it falls apart.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you.
Mandy,
that raises, sorry, can I just say very quickly, that raises a very big problematic issue of that's going to come up in the study I've just begun of rural education, which is how you pay respect and engage properly with the distinctiveness of rural places, which are all absolutely unique at the same time as not just descending into a kind of anything goes, leaving teachers and students at just the mercy of whatever they've got to hand. You know, that somehow you've got to move up and down that semantic range without losing whatever it is that you're trying to teach while engaging with that specificity. It's really difficult. Sorry, Lee, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Mandy, so given that the huge segmentalism in terms of all the different Indigenous music practices and the segmentalism in terms of knowers as well, from your study, did you find any kind of way that you could get some kind of coherence through assessments or assessment criteria, if it's not in the knowledge, if it's not in the knowers?
I think I got everything you're saying. I've just lost a bit of sound, but I'm going to answer if I'm on track to say so. Assessments were very, the assessments were you know, were revealing, because they do tell you what matters. And it was really and they were really quite, because Daniel was so concerned about integration. For instance, the students had to show the same sort of knowledge in conceptual form and in practical form. They would have to submit videos of them doing something, and they'd have to explain it, and then they'd have to do it in notation or something. So there was his idea about speaking, writing, and performing. But the content was really just the sort of conceptual music theory stuff, and then they had to show it. They were all the kind of axiological stuff was never ever, it wasn't assessed. And if it was assessed, it wasn't apparent where it was assessed. Is that what you asked?
Yeah, yes, but also whether your research would give any kind of way forward into how this could be done better, in terms of bringing some kind of, you know, some sort of assessment where the knowledge and the knowers are looked in relation to one another. You know, I'm not.
Yeah, I mean, my only suggestion for this is, apart from the fact that, you know, we need to just make sure that the semantic waves are actually happening, and it isn't just a downward journey all the time, a downward escalator. But I think that the axiological stuff needs to be named and needs to be a little bit more explicit. So instead of just having these terms about, you know, real music or whatever it is, those sorts of things, whatever they are, whether it's axiological stuff, it needs to have some kind of contextualization. And again, you're not going to get chapter and verse, because a lot of these things are difficult to pin down. But instead of this guy sprouting that and this guy sprouting that, there needs to be a sense of what does that mean and how does it fit into, it needs to be contextualized by the music itself, I think, because it is a musical practice, and there's important axiological stuff which makes it what it is. There's knowledge stuff which makes it what it is, and these form a kind of a triangle that can talk to each other, instead of there's the stuff over here and it's all very important, but you know, that's going to make you a knower maybe, and there's the stuff here which is all very important, and it's the knowledge, and you've got to write it to pass your exam. But the three, you know, the person and their music making, understanding how the axiological stuff fits into that, and how the values of the practice fit into the music you're making, as well as an understanding of the structural concepts. I've spared you those sorts of slides because they're quite technical in terms of music, but in my PhD, I tried to make those sorts of connections of taking a practice and saying, okay, let's start making connections between these things. If I'm seeing this in the music, what is it saying about the practice in terms of its values? And I had to think quite hard about that. And it's not always going to be a one-on-one sort of instrumental, you know, diagram, but it is possible to do.
Thanks, Mandy.
I think given that there's always knowledge and always knows, what you're talking about ultimately is something relevant to all of us in terms of education. You know, how do we articulate these? How do we both articulate in the sense of express both sides of this equation, and how do we articulate them, as in bring them together and connect them? So I think that's really a great you know, set of big questions that you raised here. Thanks, Mandy. Thank you very much for your round table. That was awesome. And thanks you.
I need to say one more thing, Carl. If you read the
Sure.
abstract and if you read the abstract and you go home and or you're still at home and you think, hey, hang on, what she said had nothing to do with the abstract. Deep apologies. I gave what I was going to do yesterday to the I gave a presentation to the Wits group, and we just decided to sort of take a hatchet to it and change it around. So maybe for next year's roundtable, I'll do yesterday's.
Not a
abstract once
problem.
again.
Not a
Thank you.
problem. No, not a problem at all. Thanks very much, Mandy. And
Thank you.
a number of
Thanks,
people
everyone.
are saying thank you in the chat, which Mauricio will send to you, I think, afterwards. And
Thank you.
and people can do that unsatisfying, but the best thing often you can do with that little clappy thing that people have on their screens. So, or they do that like Claire's doing. So thanks very much,
Thank you for
Mandy.
your-
Thank everybody
Thank you.
for being here as well. And I hope to see you all in a couple of weeks' time at 2 p.m. that will be. So thanks very much. And Mandy, we've recorded this, so if it's okay with you, at the end of the semester, we'll put it on YouTube if you don't mind.
Thank you. That's fine. Thanks.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Yeah, so it'll be available at some point before too long via the LCT Centre's YouTube channel. Thanks, Mandy. Thanks everyone for being here.
Cheerio. Have a good day.
Thanks, Mauricio, for running it. Mauricio, gracias.
Thank you all.
Ta-ta. Thanks, Mauricio.